News 4. Irish Sea. Inside the Royal Navy's Combat Information Center, everything was calm until one urgent update cut through the silence. Yantar had disappeared from the AIS tracking grid. The vessel had entered a crowded traffic corridor packed with fishing boats, cargo ships, and reflected radar signals, then switched off its AIS and blended into the chaos. British officers worked quickly to filter the clutter, searching for the missing target, but nothing appeared. Then the picture became clear. Yantar had quietly separated from the group and was now holding position near a strategic choke point, exactly where two critical fiber optic cables connect Europe and the United States. In a single move, NATO had been pulled into a perfect gray zone dilemma. Any direct response could be framed by Moscow as pressure against a harmless research vessel with technical issues. But waiting too long meant giving Yantar the time it needed to deploy its deep-sea equipment beneath the surface, where sensitive defense communications and financial data could become exposed like an open book. The British fleet was trapped by the very international rules it was sworn to protect. Then, just as the standoff reached its breaking point, a new signal appeared on the Link 16 network. A US Navy P-8 Poseidon was moving toward the area at high speed, carrying a solution so unusual that no standard naval manual would ever teach it. But before we get to America's unexpected move, you need to understand why the British officers inside that command room were so tense. The location Yantar was approaching was not just another patch of ocean. It was part of the hidden backbone of the Western economy. On the seabed below, fiber optic cables carry nearly all global digital traffic, work files, banking activity, government communications, and even the video you are watching right now. Moscow describes vessels like Yantar as oceanographic research ships. It sounds harmless, almost elegant. But inside NATO naval circles, that phrase often carries a very different meaning. A platform capable of mapping, monitoring, and interfering with undersea infrastructure. Yantar is linked to GUGI, Russia's main directorate of deep-sea research, a highly specialized unit focused on sensitive underwater operations. The ship is equipped with multi-frequency sonar, seismic systems, and most importantly, the AS-37 Rust deep-diving submersible, capable of reaching depths of around 6,000 meters, deeper than any NATO submarine can operate. Its robotic arms are not simply there to collect coral samples. They are built for precision work on the ocean floor, including direct contact with undersea cables. And this is the detail British officers could not ignore. Yantar's movements came shortly after a series of mysterious cable disruptions in the Baltic Sea. No official culprit, no public smoking gun, just a familiar pattern. The same kind of vessel, the same behavior, and the same silence from Moscow. In military analysis, when the same tool appears near the same kind of incident more than once, it stops looking like coincidence. Imagine this. It is 2 in the morning and you see a masked man with a crowbar standing behind your house. Would you assume he is studying the architecture of your fence, or would you take action immediately? Drop a more accurate name for this research vessel in the comments. At that moment, Yantar was performing station keeping. Its speed was close to 0. The bow shifted gently with the current, just enough to avoid looking officially anchored. On paper, it was merely drifting. But to anyone with real time at sea, this was the ideal setup for lowering equipment to the seabed without creating obvious movement on the surface. Inside the CIC of HMS Iron Duke, every eye was locked on the screens. Radar use was limited. Active sonar was out of the question. One wrong signal could escalate the situation, but one missed signal could cost NATO something far greater. At that moment, any active ping could have been picked up by Moscow, and whatever proof existed of Russia's suspicious activity could disappear in an instant. That is where U.S. Navy experience made the difference. Flying at 20,000 feet, the P-8 Poseidon held complete radio silence, while the British frigate HMS Iron Duke stayed far off on the horizon, carefully remaining outside Russian radar coverage. On board Yantar, the Russian captain felt confident. He shut down the main engine, allowed the ship to drift with the current, and sent a reconnaissance drone into the air to scan the area. He waited for 30 minutes. The radar showed nothing. The sky was quiet. The sea seemed empty. Convinced that NATO had lost track of him, he gave the order to launch the submersible. The winch began to groan as the AS-37 was lowered into the black water below. What he did not realize was that the moment the submersible touched the surface, the trap was already in place. From a safe altitude, the P-8 Poseidon released a ring of sonobuoys around Yantar, forming a tight acoustic net. The Americans did not try to stop the launch, and there was a reason for that. In naval intelligence, the sound of secret equipment in action is incredibly valuable. Every turn of the winch, every burst from the ballast pumps, every movement of the submersible's propeller was captured, recorded, and analyzed by U.S. sensors. The Russian captain believed he was carrying out a covert mission. In reality, he was handing the Office of Naval Intelligence a fresh acoustic fingerprint of Russian equipment at no cost. He thought he was gathering information, but he had become the source of it. Now, HMS Iron Duke no longer needed to activate its own radar to track the Russians. Instead, it shifted to MCON Alpha, full emission control, shutting down its own active systems and moving through the darkness almost like a ghost, guided by the eyes and ears of the P-8 through the data link. Inside the CIC of HMS Iron Duke, the full picture finally came together. Yantar was no longer just behaving like a research vessel. It was engaged in an underwater operation directly above NATO's critical infrastructure. But one problem remained. There was still not enough legal justification for direct action. The British had the technical evidence, but what they needed was a decisive trigger, something that would stop the Russians from continuing without giving them a chance to present themselves as the victim. For the first few minutes, everything remained in that gray zone. The AS-37 slipped silently beneath the surface and vanished into the deep. Above, Yantar maintained what looked like a lawful drift. No broadcasts, no emissions, no obvious procedural mistake. If anyone questioned it, they could simply say they were conducting research. But on the seabed, the reality was very different. As the Russian submersible moved closer to the fiber optic cable bundle, American hydrophones picked up a sound that could not be brushed aside under international law. Metal striking metal. Not the natural sound of water, not routine background noise. It was the unmistakable sound of manipulator arms making contact with the cable. That was the moment everything changed. Inside HMS Iron Duke's CIC, the tactical action officer looked up. There was no longer any need for debate. This was no longer a suspicious presence. It was direct interference with strategic infrastructure. A short message appeared on the shared tactical display. Hostile underwater activity confirmed. And then the Americans made their move. The P-8 Poseidon began to descend, not in a way that looked aggressive, but low enough to be seen, low enough to deliver a message without saying a single word. "We know what you're doing down there." On Yantar's deck, the Russian captain went silent. But Gugi crews were not known for giving up easily. On the bridge, he chose one final, risky move. Instead of bringing the submersible back up, he ordered the crew to activate a non-lethal but highly disruptive system, laser dazzlers. From the side of the vessel, intense green beams cut through the night, aimed toward the cockpit of the P-8 and the optical sensors of HMS Iron Duke. It was a classic gray zone tactic, the maritime version of throwing dust into someone's eyes during a contest. The message from Yantar was clear: back away or an incident might happen and Moscow would claim NATO caused it. The Russian captain believed the pressure would force the alliance to step aside. But he had forgotten one important detail. U.S. Navy pilots are not trained to retreat from a bright light. Instead of pulling away, the P-8 Poseidon accepted the challenge. The pilot put on laser protection goggles, pushed the engines forward, and performed a low-level pass known in cruise slang as the barber's cut. The large aircraft dropped to just 200 feet above the sea, lower than the Eiffel Tower, and thundered over Yantar at 400 knots. The force of the air behind the engine slammed across the Russian ship's deck like an invisible hammer. And that was only the first part of the lesson. At the same time, HMS Iron Duke broke its silent posture, accelerated to flank speed, and made a sharp turn across Yantar's bow at extremely close range. This was a wake maneuver. A huge wall of water rolled off the stern of the British warship and crashed into Yantar's side, combining with the pressure from the American aircraft above. The result was immediate. The 6,000-ton ship rocked violently, rolling as much as 25 degrees, as if it were a small buoy in rough weather. The green beams on deck suddenly disappeared because the operator could no longer keep steady. More importantly, the crane holding the cable connected to the AS-37 below began swinging hard, slamming against the ship's structure. Imagine trying to thread a needle while riding a bull. That was the situation facing the Russian technical team. The sea does not care about politics. Hydrodynamics is fair, cold, and unforgiving. Without launching a single round, NATO had turned the water around Yantar into a chaotic washing machine, making any precise underwater operation impossible. The covert mission had collapsed into confusion. Now the Russian captain had no choice. He shouted orders to recover the submersible immediately before the cable failed and the AS-37 was lost to the deep. On the P-8's display, the Americans watched what naval crews often call the walk of shame. The Russian crew rushed to pull the AS-37 back onto the deck like intruders caught in the act. Searchlights from the aircraft and the British ship lit them up from every angle, exposing the confusion across the vessel. No direct engagement took place, but the outcome was clear. They had been stopped. And here is the part Yantar's captain was lucky to avoid. Had he gone further and ordered the robotic arm to sever that fiber optic cable, the return journey would have looked very different. The floor of the North Atlantic is not empty, and it is not forgotten. It is watched by the United States Integrated Undersea Surveillance System, a network designed to detect movement beneath the surface. In that scenario, the response would not have come from the sky. It would have come from below. There is a strong chance that a U.S. Virginia-class submarine was already nearby, hidden beneath the thermal layer just a few miles away, silent, patient, and fully aware of what Yantar was attempting to do. All this time, it had been there, silent as a black hole beneath the ocean. It did not need to switch on sonar. It did not need to announce itself. It simply waited below the thermal layer, invisible to almost everyone, with every system ready and every move carefully calculated. If Yantar had gone one step further and damaged the cable, the situation would have changed instantly. It would no longer be a vessel conducting research. It would become a direct threat to critical infrastructure, and at that point, the response would not come with speeches or warnings. It would come with speed, precision, and no hesitation. Before the Russian captain even understood how badly he had miscalculated, the 6,000-ton ship could have become the newest landmark on the ocean floor. So what is the real lesson from that long, intense night? It is the end of old-style power thinking in a world now ruled by information. Russia arrived with tools from the previous century, large platforms, shadows, pressure tactics, and the hope that darkness and confusion would give them an advantage. They believed that by switching off AIS and hiding inside crowded sea traffic, they could disappear. But the U.S. Navy answered with modern multi-domain operations. The West was not just watching with human eyes. It was reading the electromagnetic spectrum, listening through underwater sensors, tracking patterns, and turning every sound into data. You can turn off AIS. You can drift beside fishing vessels. You can pretend to be harmless, but you cannot hide from physics. And that night, Moscow learned a hard lesson. The moment a ship leaves port, its movement, its sound, and even its rhythm can already be part of someone else's intelligence picture. Now, a quick reality check. At Navy Vector, we respect accuracy. This story dramatizes real-world capabilities in a what-if scenario. Yantar is a real vessel connected to deep-sea operations, and the systems described here are based on known military concepts. However, specific moments such as the close wake maneuver, the low aircraft pass, and the undersea response are hypothetical, created to show how these forces could interact in a high-pressure situation. Now the final question is yours. After a night like this, would Russia risk returning to these waters and targeting undersea cables again? Or next time, would they arrive with a much heavier escort instead of relying on a disguised research ship? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy deep naval analysis like this, hit the like button and subscribe so you do not miss the next breakdown.